The following presentation was given at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Tupelo in Tupelo, Mississippi. All are welcome to join us on Sundays at 11 a.m. at 1301 Marshall Street in Tupelo.
I liked movies when I was a kid, and I've done a sermon here on movies, and I've done that movies elsewhere. I also like music and rock and roll. And I remember an early song that I enjoyed called The Purple People Eater. Remember that? Purple People Eater, what's your kind? Anyway, that was one of my first exposures to the idea of creatures drastically different from us, that could be floating around and Lord knows could end up turning up somewhere on Earth. But really, perhaps we should go back further and blame all of this on H.G. Wells, who wrote in 1897 his book War of the Worlds, one of our best and earliest science fiction writers. And we all know that a lot of what was once science fiction, sometimes many years later, becomes science fact. And then, of course, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the great and weird event that happened in 1938 when a radio play of War in the Worlds was broadcast with Orson Welles, I think was the narrator, and people turned on the radio and they thought it was a real broadcast. And they thought that these little people had actually landed and were coming after them. And there was a nationwide panic. Took quite a bit to quell it. So that's one of the origin stories. Then it wasn't until about 9 years later, in 1947, that this infinitely strange incident happened in Roswell, New Mexico, which to this day, the entire town economy seems to be based on the possibility that there was an incident nearby. Now, that incident has been subject to huge controversy, and there has never been a terribly definitive answer to what happened. There was an actual press release sent out by the military base there that a flying saucer had landed and been found, and then of course it was immediately disavowed very quickly, and that controversy has lived on and on. Now, this is just a little personal aside, and I know anecdotal evidence is not anything most of us want to pay a lot of attention to, but I'll just say New Mexico is an interesting place in general. She just mentioned when I talk about the woman at Ottawa Crossing, a place that lots of strange things seem possible. Anyway, I actually, when I had told friends of mine out there that I was going to Roswell, and then when I came back with reports of my adventure there, one of my oldest friends of 50 years there, a woman named Ava Fullerton, said, "Gail, you're laughing at this, but let me tell you a story." So she told me about an elderly relative of one of her closest friends, a woman who had actually met. The name of the family name is Ely. Apparently, at the time of the supposed Roswell incident, this woman who had just died in her 90s, she and her husband had been at home when the man who was the commander at the military base there came over looking very distraught and said to them, "This is worth my career and possibly my life, but I have to talk to somebody I trust." And that he had actually told them that he had seen a craft and he had seen some unusual little creatures in that craft. So I didn't solicit this, I wasn't looking for it, and I'm not sure I wanted to know this, but this elderly woman had indeed then confessed to a couple of close relatives and friends that she didn't want to go to her grave with this information. So this is a personal story. When I posted the other day that I was going to be doing this service and posted a picture of one of my main resources, this book on UFOs, not one, not two, but three of my personal acquaintances shared with me that they had seen, in their opinion, a UFO. One of my friends who lives now in Arkansas insisted that he had seen 3 in different parts of the world. So here we go. Historically, it may be reasonable to trace a lot of this UFO alien stuff to either the War of the Worlds incidents and or Roswell. But the fact is, this wonderfully researched book indicates that this is a worldwide phenomenon. Needless to say, in the United States, we mostly hear about the ones that have happened nearby. There was a famous incident in Phoenix called the Phoenix Lights event that had a very interesting history. This was actually seen by hundreds of people, something near the airport, but it was not attributed, could not be attributed to anything that was actually happening at the airport that anybody was in control of. And it was such an interesting phenomenon that the governor at the time, Governor Fife Symington, felt necessary to call a press conference, at which press conference he brought in somebody dressed up in a kind of alien costume and basically downplayed the whole incident, acted like it was just a fun kind of a joke thing, and had this creature in alien costume get up and, say something, and essentially poo-pooed it. However, a few years later, when he was no longer in office, he revealed that he had actually seen it himself and found it very unnerving. So this book documents testimony by lots of high-level people, including a lot of people that are not very likely to be what you'd call gullible or credible about sightings, many of them by high-level people in military operations all around the world. There's a major incident in Belgium, major incidents in Peru, Brazil, Turkey, just everywhere. And she has interviewed a lot of people, and some of them have even written their own eyewitness accounts. Now, that's a little historical and kind of anecdotal material. Now, scientifically, the general current scientific consensus is that interstellar travel of the type that would be necessary for some of these things to truly be sort of governed, run by, as it were, extraterrestrial life is just not possible. But there's a famous quote by Arthur Schopenhauer: "All truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is accepted as self-evident." And I think we can all look back through human history and scientific developments and realize that that is a very prescient quote. Many years later, Thomas Kuhn wrote a book called The Nature of Scientific Revolutions, and he talked about how paradigm shifts can pop up suddenly and unexpectedly, and things that were once understood as common knowledge suddenly no longer are so. So in addition to the sort of general scientific consensus that some of this stuff is not really physically possible, more and more theoretical physicists are now playing around, as I'm sure you know, with string theory and ideas of multidimensional space and wormholes and all this sort of thing, and possibly even time travel. So a whole lot of new theories are being talked about by people that are well-educated and seemingly sane. So that's a little bit on the scientific front. Now, another area we need to look into, of course, looking at this issue, is the huge area of political implications. So what Fife Symington said about his experience of actually seeing something but trying to debunk it at the same time, perhaps that is something that is going on in a much more widespread way. The United States at one point did have a group called the Blue Book Project that was looking pretty seriously into reports about UFO phenomena, but that's been closed down for years. France seems to be the main country that has kept an investigative unit under the auspices officially of its government going the longest, and out of France, about 20 years ago, came something called the Cometa Report, which is what got this reporter interested in the subject. And after she read that report and saw some of the credible people that were saying they had indeed seen things that were not to be explained by any normal criteria, she started investigating. Another person who's been very big on investigating both the political and scientific area is filmmaker James Fox, who I watched a couple of his documentaries while I was somehow caught up in the world of UFOlogy this summer. And he's a kind of a skeptic. At the same time, he says, there's just too much out there to totally disdain this whole issue. And his suggestion is that we maintain an attitude of openness to the whole question. So some people, very prone to conspiracy theories, are convinced that the U.S. government knows all about everything and is hiding it from us. And anything is possible. But it's interesting that several U.S. presidents, supposedly, including Clinton and supposedly even our current president, have actually indicated that they would like to know if there's anything that the government knows that we're not being told, and even they have not apparently been able to find out anything. What we do know is that numerous governments around the world have little groups of people that are interested and are looking into it. Many, many pilots, commercial pilots, have reported seeing odd things. And what the best statistics that James Fox, the filmmaker, after a great deal of research, has come up with is that at least 5 to 7% of the incidents that have been investigated over the last 70 or so years, there's no physical explanation. Many of them have been explained by various phenomenon that are natural, but there is this troubling 5 to 7% for which nothing, sometimes even after many years, has been able to explain, and especially some of those that have had a large number of so-called eyewitnesses. So politically, I don't know. I do know, as I said, that people like John Podesta and Shai Symington, who are clearly not crazy people and who have some credibility in the political realm, seem to think there's something worth continuing to look into. Now, on to the sort of psychological and spiritual religious implications, if any. So the most interesting part, of course, of the UFO festival was not speculations about the nature of what spacecraft we might have seen. To me, was not even speculations about what physical form any kind of extraterrestrial life might take, but was very simply the testimony of people who claimed what has now been called, I guess, post the famous movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Now, I knew that this existed. I had no idea until hearing all these talks how huge it is. Huge. And it's been huge for quite a while. This is a worldwide phenomena that thousands upon thousands of people claim to have had personal encounters with, not little green men usually, but different kinds of beings that do not seem to fit our normal description. The story from the Roswell story was that I thought was a clever quote. One person said, "Did you see the little green men?" And the reply was, "They weren't green, they were gray." So that's just throwing that out there. Some of the creatures look like the ones you've probably seen depicted, and similar to the ones that were the big eyes. And some of them are small. Sometimes they're depicted as large. Some are depicted as sort of mantis people that have sort of a bug-like quality, which I personally find a little disturbing. But a whole field of psychology has risen around this phenomenon. There are people whose entire practice consists entirely of working with people who have reported one or sometimes more of these experiences. Several currently practicing psychologists spoke in various panels and lectures at this thing in Roswell, and told us of the great pain that some people go through as a result of having these experiences, but some people report it as a very transcendental kind of experience. And one of the psychologists, I think her last name was Fox. Anyway, I sat through her entire talk, and she said that she's seeing more and more as she interviews people that they're saying that they are being selected to be kind of a vanguard to save the planet. Now, if you think about, as Jung said, even before we really understood the ramifications of climate change, global warming, now mostly better term is climate change. We've always known for a long time that technology is in many ways threatening our continued successful existence on the planet, and perhaps out of that has come a great sense that what now may have to save us is a different kind of technology, a technology that might be able to explain things like flying objects that can hover and take off with no sound and no clearly discernible source of energy. So Miss Fox has written a book called The Chosen, where she talks about these people who feel that they have been selected as kind of this vanguard to save the planet and therefore, in a sense, save humankind. Now, the idea of being chosen sort of by something larger than human goes way back to the idea that the Jewish people were the chosen people, and that God delivered the Torah, those 10 Commandments to Moses and the rest of the Torah to various prophets. So this is not a new concept. And it's also very clear that many people have a great need to feel special. So I offer this simply as some speculation about why this happens. Now, I hadn't really thought, other than having read about Carl Jung's little booklet for a long time, much about the religious implications of this. But my friend that I was with in Roswell's podcast, she just kept on researching, and she found a modern woman. Jung died about 45, 50 years ago. A young woman named Diana Pusalka, who has written a book fairly recently called American Cosmic: UFOs, Religion, and Technology. She says in this very interesting statistic, she says more than half of all Americans believe in some kind of extraterrestrial life, and that 75% of younger people are totally convinced of it. And she's interested in the intersection between the UFO and possible alien or abductions, which are now, they prefer to be called experiencers rather than abductees because it has less of a sinister connotation. So I've just learned all kinds of things. There's even political correctness in the world of UFOs. So we are now no longer to call them abductees, but experiencers if we are one or we meet somebody, of which, as I said, I apparently now know several in my personal circle. So one of the things that became very clear to me is if you look back at certain world scriptures, especially I was thinking of the Hindu scripture, which goes on for their 11 volumes with the Mahabharata, that scripture is full of descriptions of creatures and other kinds of beings than the one that we normally associate with the human and or even animal world that were supposedly walking in the earth, and some of them seem eerily similar to some of the images that one gets when one hears about UFO sightings and perhaps being taken into a spaceship and given either instructions and or in some cases having some sort of medical procedure done. So who knows? So she, in her book, Diana Pusalka, argues that this phenomenon goes way back far beyond H.G. Wells and could explain a lot of ancient religious scriptures, and also could be addressed by things like the idea of the fairy faith in Celtic countries, the idea of really tiny beings and spectacularly large beings. So this is where kind of the psychology and religion kind of merges. Now, what do I think? Well, I love the fact that what Leslie Kean argues in the end of this book, she argues for a kind of outlook on life that I think Unitarian Universalist can understand and embrace, a worldview and a way of being in the world that goes far beyond what we think about the possibility of UFOs. Now, apparently the new term of art is unidentified aerial phenomenon. So you've got this two ways to be politically correct. No longer UFOs, unidentified aerial phenomenon, and no longer abductees, but experiencers. So now we're all PC'd up. So she argues for what she calls a sort of radical skepticism, an openness to take new information in, an openness to hearing stories of anecdotal value, an openness to paying attention to scientists who are operating sometimes at the margins of academia and at the margins of respectability, a respectable sort of skepticism about what governments may or may not be telling us, and a radical openness to the possibility that, as Thomas Kuhn and Schopenhauer told us, that what is now known may not be nearly all there is, that over the course of time, all will be revealed, maybe. And to me, that's our Unitarian Universalist liberal philosophy anyway, a sort of glorious uncertainty. I'm always as suspicious of what I call militant atheist as I am of radical fundamentalist. My feeling is you just don't know, and neither do I. So as we talk about this topic today, first I want to make sure that all of you would feel safe if you've had a, shall we say, close or not so close encounter, either just saw something in the sky that seemed weird, or if you had a sense, sometimes it can feel like a dream. Sometimes people tell me it doesn't feel like a dream, but people will interpret it as such where you feel like you've had an encounter. I hope you'll feel safe to tell other people after this. My friend and I I meant to bring it with me, but we had little T-shirts made up when we were in Roswell that said, tell me about your alien encounter. Now, of course, we know that some of these terms are not quite politically correct. People did tell us. Some surprisingly credible people told personal stories. One was a guy who told about an encounter where he and a friend had an encounter near a military base in the Southwest. It seems to be a prominent place, the Southwest, and some certain parts of the world seem more prone to these incidents than others. And he and his friend were subsequently separated after this encounter, and they told some of their higher-ups, and the friend was then stationed somewhere else far, far away, and they were encouraged to never speak about it again. And he was an elderly man, an attorney, and he wrote a book called Incident at something, I have the card somewhere, Incident at some creek. And his voice shook when he talked. He talked about how he had told his wife a little bit about his experience, but he had never told his adult children until he decided to write a book about it to finally get some kind of closure. There are numerous of these kind of stories. As I said, there are numerous books, including one written by a top Harvard psychologist named John Mackey about 25 years ago called Abduction, in which he had encountered and done work with a number of people who had reported these experiences. The only person that I heard talk about this idea that some of this phenomenon is being directed towards somehow training or teaching or preparing this cadre of people was this Dr. Fox, but perhaps there are others as well. As I said, this is a phenomenon that apparently not just maybe thousands, but perhaps millions of people worldwide are either see themselves as having been had a sighting, had an experience, or are just interested in it. So when I saw those statistics, about 50% of everybody thinks it's possible and 75% of younger people, I found that very interesting. So all I have to say is, let us maintain as we go forward here, our glorious sense of uncertainty and living with ambiguity. We may not ever in our lifetime know what's really been going on, but it certainly appears that weird things are happening. And maybe, as the X-Files tells us, the truth is actually out there somewhere. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the UUC of Tupelo's podcast. You can find us at uuctupeloms.org, on Facebook by searching for UUC Tupelo, or contact us by email at uuctupelocom@gmail.com. That's uuctupelocom@gmail.com. The UUC of Tupelo is a welcoming congregation who accept all people, regardless of creed, color, national origin, gender, or gender identity. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and as you head on your way, go in peace, believe in peace, create peace.